June 14, 2009, 11:47 p.m. Beneath a restaurant in Lower Manhattan. The laughter started before she even reached the table. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of laughter men make when they believe the world exists solely to serve them. Sharp exhales, smirks passed between men who had spent their lives turning fear into currency. She balanced a tray heavy with glasses she could barely afford to break. "Careful now," one of them muttered, loud enough for the table to hear. "Wouldn't want you dropping something you can't pay for." The table erupted. Low, satisfied laughter, the kind that doesn't need a punchline because the cruelty is the joke. She kept her eyes down, always down. That was the rule. That was how you survived in rooms like this. Rooms filled with men who owned restaurants without ever eating in them, who ordered executions as casually as dessert, who believed that power was measured by how invisible you could make the people serving you. To them, she wasn't a person. She was the waitress, the girl who cleared ashtrays, the girl who refilled glasses, the girl who knew better than to speak unless spoken to. One man leaned back in his chair, examining her like a broken appliance. "Where do they find these ones?" he asked, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You look scared of your own shadow." Another chuckled. "Probably fresh off the street." Their laughter grew louder, more confident. They were comfortable here. This was their kingdom, a private room beneath a restaurant no one dared question. Deals were made here, lives were ended here, and tonight they were celebrating a victory no one outside these walls would ever hear about. She stood motionless as the insults piled up. No one noticed her knuckles whitening around the tray. No one noticed the way her breathing slowed, not from fear, but from control. One man flicked his cigarette ash toward the floor near her shoes. "Clean that up," he said. "That's what you're here for." She knelt, not because she had to, because she chose to. As she wiped the floor, their voices continued above her, careless, arrogant, convinced of their own invincibility. Names were spoken, routes mentioned, plans hinted at with smug confidence. They spoke freely, openly, assuming the woman at their feet was nothing more than furniture. And in that moment, they made the worst mistake of their lives. Because while they were laughing, while they were mocking her poverty, her silence, her position beneath them, they failed to notice the smallest change in her expression, the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes lifted, not in fear, but in calculation. They had mistaken stillness for weakness, they had mistaken silence for submission, and they had no idea that the woman kneeling on the floor of their private room was the same woman whose name made men disappear, the same woman whose absence could end careers, the same woman whose husband ruled everything they thought they controlled. They thought she was nothing. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. The laughter died slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, like air leaking from a pressurized chamber. One man stopped mid-sentence. Another shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable without knowing why. Something in the air had changed, though none of them could yet explain what it was. The woman rose from the floor. She moved with calm precision, smoothing her skirt, placing the tray gently on the table. No rush, no trembling, no fear. Just control. And that was when one of them noticed it. Her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. A man near the far end of the table squinted at her, his smile fading. He'd seen fear before, thousands of times. Fear had a smell, a posture, a rhythm. What stood in front of him now was not fear. It was restraint. "Hey," he said slowly, voice tightening. You work here long?" She met his eyes for the first time. "Long enough." That was all she said. The room fell quiet. Another man laughed nervously, trying to reclaim the mood. "What's with the questions? She's just a waitress." But even as he spoke, he avoided her gaze, because something wasn't right. because the men who ran this city didn't look at servants like that, not with uncertainty creeping up their spines like frost. One of them reached for his phone, intending to call the owner of the place, to complain, to reassert control. But before he could dial, the door behind them opened. No announcement. No warning. Just the soft click of a lock disengaging. Every head turned. The man who stepped inside didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone rearranged the room. He wore a simple black coat, unmarked, unassuming, but everyone in that room knew his face, knew his reputation, knew the trail of silence that followed him wherever he went. Men stood up without realizing they were doing it. One chair scraped loudly against the floor. Another man dropped his phone. No one spoke his name. They didn't have to. The woman turned slowly and faced him. For the first time since she entered the room, she smiled. Not a smile of triumph, a smile of recognition. The man's eyes softened in a way no one there had ever seen before. He crossed the room without looking at anyone else, didn't acknowledge the fear, didn't acknowledge the power he held over every man present. He stopped in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No," she replied, "but they were careless." The word careless landed like a death sentence. The room felt smaller, heavier. Every man in it understood the shift that had just taken place, the moment when prey realizes it has been standing beside the hunter all along. The man turned slowly to face the table. His voice was calm, cold. "You were all very brave," he said, "when you thought she was alone." Silence swallowed the room. No one moved, no one breathed. And for the first time that night, the most dangerous men in the city understood exactly how fragile their lives really were. By every known rule of survival in the underworld, they should have been able to act. They should have been able to negotiate, to deflect, to escape. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. They couldn't. Not with her there, not with him watching, not with history already leaning against them. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of realization, the kind that arrives too late to matter. The man in the black coat didn't move closer to the table. He didn't need to. His stillness was more threatening than any gesture. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder, and let them understand what they had done. She stepped forward, not beside him, not behind him, in front of him, and that, more than anything, told the men at the table exactly how much power she held. "You spoke freely tonight," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "You mentioned names, routes, schedules." One man's face went pale, another gripped the edge of the table as if it might steady him. She continued, unhurried. "You spoke because you believed I was nothing. By every rational calculation, this should not have been possible. A waitress, poor, overlooked, dismissed, should never have been in a position to leverage information against men like these. But the underworld operates on a simple principle. Information is survival, and the men at this table had just handed her theirs. One of the older men, silver-haired, steady, tried to salvage the situation. "We didn't know," he said, voice measured. "We didn't mean any disrespect to you or your husband." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she agreed, "you didn't know. That's the problem." Her husband finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Carelessness," he said, "is the only sin I don't forgive." The words hung in the air like smoke. The silver-haired man swallowed hard. He had negotiated treaties, ended wars, orchestrated disappearances, but he had no leverage here, no allies, no escape route. Because the woman they had mocked now held every secret they had spilled. She walked slowly around the table, her footsteps deliberate. each one a reminder of how badly they had miscalculated. "You have two choices," she said. "You can leave this room and pretend tonight never happened, or you can leave this room and ensure tonight never happened." The implication was clear. One man nodded quickly, desperately. "We'll forget. We'll—" "I wasn't finished," she said, her voice like ice. He froze. She stopped walking and turned to face them all. "If I hear my name spoken again in a room like this, if I hear his name used carelessly, casually, as if you have the right, then the information you gave me tonight will be delivered to every rival, every federal agent, every man who wants you dead." The room seemed to contract. "Do you understand?" One by one, they nodded, not out of respect, out of fear. The men at the table had spent their entire lives learning how to read a room, how to identify weakness, how to exploit hesitation, how to know when someone was bluffing, but none of them could read her. She stood at the head of the table now, her husband a silent presence behind her, and the dynamic was unmistakable. He had given her the floor, he had stepped back. And that decision, more than any threat, any weapon, any display of force, told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't his revenge, it was hers. One of the men, a stocky enforcer with scars running down his forearm, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Look," he said, voice rough but measured, "we made a mistake. We didn't know who you were, but we can make this right. Name your price." She didn't even look at him. "My price," she said slowly, "is that you never forget this moment." The enforcers blinked, confused. "That's it?" he asked. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time her expression hardened. "You think forgetting is easy? You think you'll walk out of here and go back to your life and this will just fade?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "Every time you see a waitress, you'll wonder. Every time someone serves you, cleans up after you, stands in the background, you'll ask yourself, who are they? Who do they know? What did I just say in front of them?" The enforcer's jaw tightened. "You'll second-guess every word, every laugh, every careless sentence, because tonight you learned that invisibility isn't weakness, it's camouflage." By every known rule of power, fear should dissipate once the threat is removed. But the fear she was planting wasn't about immediate danger, it was about uncertainty. The kind that eats away at a man's confidence, the kind that makes him hesitate, the kind that, in their world, gets you killed. One of the younger men at the table, the one who had laughed the loudest, finally broke. "We're sorry," he said, voice cracking. "We're sorry, please. We didn't mean—" "Stop." Her husband's voice cut through the room like a blade. The young man froze. The Mafia boss stepped forward, standing beside his wife now, and when he spoke his tone was almost conversational. "You apologized to her," he said. "That's good. That's a start." The young man nodded frantically. "But an apology doesn't undo what you said. It doesn't erase the names you mentioned, the routes, the schedules." The young man's face went white. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this room, you're going to go back to your lives, and you're going to remember that your survival tonight was a gift." He let the words settle. "And gifts," he said quietly, "can always be taken back." The men understood. This wasn't mercy, it was a suspended sentence. One mistake, one careless word, one moment of disrespect, one hint that they had forgotten this lesson, and the information she held would be released. Their rivals would know their plans, the feds would know their routes, their own people would know they had been compromised, they would be hunted by everyone, and it would all trace back to this moment, to the night they mocked a waitress. She turned away from the table, dismissing them without another word. Her husband followed, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back, a gesture of unity, of absolute trust. The door closed behind them, and the men sat in silence, finally understanding the full weight of what they had lost. Not money, not territory. Control. June 15th, 2009, 2:34 a.m. A penthouse overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge. Word traveled fast in their world. Not through phones, those could be tapped. Not through messengers, those could be turned. Word traveled through absence, through the sudden cancellation of meetings, through the men who didn't show up to collections, through the fear that moved like a virus through the network. By dawn, every major crew in the city knew something had happened. They didn't know the details, but they knew enough. The boss's wife had been disrespected, and the men who did it were still breathing. That second part, the fact they were alive, was what terrified everyone. Because in their world, disrespect was met with immediate, brutal consequences. A bullet, a disappearance, a message sent so clearly that no one would ever make the same mistake. But this time, there had been no retaliation, no blood, no bodies, just silence. And silence in the underworld is the loudest sound of all. In a social club in Bay Ridge, 3 capos sat around a table, speaking in low voices. "You hear what happened?" one asked. The others nodded. "Frankie's crew," another said. "They were running their mouths in front of her, didn't know who she was." How the hell did they not know? Because she was dressed like staff, kept her head down, played the part. The first man shook his head slowly. That's not luck, that's strategy. The others fell silent, because he was right. A woman connected to that level of power didn't end up in a room full of loose-lipped soldiers by accident. She had been placed there, or she had placed herself there. Either way, it meant one thing. She was operational. Not a trophy wife, not a passive presence. She was active, informed, dangerous. "Word is," the third man said quietly, "she's been doing this for months. Different restaurants, different rooms, always in the background." "Jesus Christ," the first man muttered. "How much does she know?" No one answered, because the answer was too terrifying to say out loud. By every historical precedent in organized crime, wives were kept separate. Protected, yes. Respected, absolutely. But separate. They attended events, they managed appearances, they provided legitimacy. They did not gather intelligence. They did not operate in the field. They did not sit in rooms full of soldiers and absorb operational details. But she had done exactly that. And now every crew in the city had to operate under a new assumption. Anyone could be watching. The waitress, the cleaner, the bartender, the woman behind the counter at the bakery. Any of them could be her. Any of them could be reporting back. In a dimly lit office in Red Hook, a man named Calvetti, the same name mentioned in that private room, stared at his phone. He had received 3 calls in the last hour, all from different people, all saying the same thing. Your name was spoken. She heard it. Calvetti had been in the life for 30 years. He had survived wars, indictments, betrayals. He knew how to handle pressure. But this was different, because he didn't know what she had heard, didn't know what conclusions she had drawn, didn't know if his name was on a list somewhere waiting to be used. He poured himself a drink with a shaking hand. For the first time in 30 decades, Calvetti felt something he thought he'd forgotten: vulnerability. Across the city, the same realization was spreading. The men who mocked her had been humiliated, yes, but the real punishment wasn't what happened to them. It was what happened to everyone else, because now no one felt safe. No one knew who was listening. And in a world built on secrets, that uncertainty was a death sentence waiting to be executed. She had done something no soldier, no capo, no boss had ever managed to do. She had made the entire network afraid of its own shadow. 3 months later, September 2009, the restaurant beneath which it all happened closed quietly. No announcement, no explanation, just a sign on the door that read, "Under new management." The private room was sealed off, repainted, the table removed, every trace of that night erased as if it had never existed. But the men who had been there would never forget. They moved through the city differently now, more carefully, more cautiously. They stopped speaking freely in restaurants, stopped trusting the silence of empty rooms, stopped assuming that the people serving them were powerless. One by one, they made mistakes, small ones at first, missed shipments, botched collections, opportunities lost because they hesitated when they should have acted. And then the mistakes grew larger. A shipment seized at Red Hook, the exact route mentioned that night. An arrest made during a meeting, at the exact time and place discussed carelessly over drinks. A rival crew moving into territory that should have been protected, because the men guarding it were too busy looking over their shoulders. Each incident could have been coincidence, but in their world there are no coincidences, only consequences. By the end of the year, 3 of the men from that table had been quietly removed from positions of authority, not killed, demoted, sidelined, made irrelevant, because fear makes men unreliable, and unreliable men are liabilities. The youngest one, the one who had laughed the loudest, left the city entirely, moved to Florida, opened a car wash, spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder at every customer, every employee, every stranger who walked through the door. The enforcer with the scars took a plea deal on an unrelated charge, served 18 months, came out diminished, broken, no longer the man he had been. The silver-haired diplomat, the one who had tried to negotiate, suffered a heart attack during a meeting, survived but never returned to the life, retired to a house upstate, where he sat on a porch and stared at the trees, haunted by the memory of a woman whose name he never learned. And her? She disappeared. Not literally, she still existed, still moved through the city, but no one saw her the same way anymore. She became a story, a warning, a legend whispered in back rooms and late-night conversations. The waitress who wasn't a waitress, the woman who heard everything, the wife who brought down crews without firing a single shot. Some claimed she still did it, still moved through restaurants, hotels, social clubs, invisible and observing. Others said she had retired, that the fear she created was enough to last a lifetime. No one knew for certain, and that was exactly the point. Her husband never spoke about that night publicly, but those close to him noticed a change. He consulted her more, deferred to her judgment, brought her into meetings not as decoration but as counsel, because he had always known what she was capable of. That night she had simply shown everyone else. By every known rule of organized crime, power is taken through violence, through force, through fear, through the willingness to destroy anyone who stands in your way. But she had proven something different, that power could be taken through patience, through observation, through the willingness to be underestimated until the exact moment it mattered most. June 14, 2009, 11:47 p.m. The night the laughter started. The night a group of men mocked a waitress and sealed their own fates. The night the underworld learned that invisibility is not weakness, it is the most dangerous weapon of all. She had been treated like dirt, and in response she had buried them all, not with violence, with something far more permanent: doubt. The kind that never dies, the kind that spreads, the kind that turns predators into prey and makes the powerful question every shadow, every silence, every person they once ignored. They thought she was nothing. History proved them catastrophically wrong, and in a world built on certainty, she had introduced something far more lethal: the knowledge that they would never, ever be safe again. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and never miss what comes next.